Hello and good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to make sure everyone who's joining today can finish logging into this call. I think we're ready to go. Welcome to this East West Railway Company online public event for the Shelfords to Cambridge and Harlton to Hauxton. My name is Claire Keith Anderson and I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at East West Railway Company. Following the launch of the second round of non-statutory consultation on the 31st of March, this week we're holding the second round of online events or webinars. The focus of today's session is on responding to the questions raised by communities to date. For those wanting more detailed dialogue with specialists from the project team, please attend any of our live chat events. The details are on the screen and we'll give you more details as we go through the webinar. We will start with a quick run through of what we're consulting on in your area, and please do use the Q&A feature to ask us further questions and to post comments. But please remember, the focus of this morning's event is on responding to questions already raised to date by yourselves. If time allows, we will respond to one or two new questions arising via the Q&A function during the webinar before we wrap up with some next steps. We are holding similar sessions across the whole route between Oxford and Cambridge throughout this week. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the rest of the team. Joining us today, we also have our Programme Manager for Connection Stage 3, Paul Sparrow, our Environment and Sustainability Manager, Tristan Lincoln-Gordon, our Head of Operations, Maria Cliff, our Head of Customer Strategy, Martin Phillips, our Land and Property Manager, Jan Pace, and Philip Alliston, a Senior Advisor from our Land and Property Consultants. We also have Hannah and Karis behind the scenes helping us today. Before we start the presentation, I'm going to run through a brief housekeeping and Teams Live note. Many of you might be familiar with Teams Live, but just a reminder, you'll be on mute throughout. You'll find the bar below the Q&A feature where my colleague has just posted a message. Please note that we are recording these sessions and therefore will not reference any names or descriptions directly, even if provided in the question, for GDPR purposes. That's all the housekeeping. Let's get on with the presentation. And I'll hand over to Maria.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everybody. My name is Maria Cliff, and I'm Head of Operations for East West Railway Company. We're going to start today with a very quick recap of what we're consulting on, so really we can spend the majority of this morning's session covering key themes that have emerged and answering some specific questions that may have come from some of you, our attendees this morning, and some of the other respondents that we've had to the consultation so far. So thanks, Karis. Next slide, please. So as many of you are aware, East West Rail is a proposed new rail link between Oxford and Cambridge, which we will be opening in stages across 3 different connection stages to provide rail services up to Milton Keynes, through to Bedford, and then eventually through to Cambridge, we hope by the end of the decade. We've split the consultation into 2 predominant sections. The first is around customer experience and railway operations, and the second is specific to the infrastructure development, and again split into 6 different geographic sections across the route between Oxford and Cambridge. So the consultation is running through to the 2nd week of June, and it is this part of the process, the non-statutory consultation, is for you to give us your thoughts and feedback on the emerging proposals before we move into the next stage of the statutory consultation for the route. So I'll start with customer experience and railway operations. It's really important to us at East West Rail that we look at the end-to-end journey from a customer perspective. So that takes in right from when you start to plan your journey through to post-journey experience. We're looking at the train service that we offer in terms of calling patterns, into the station experience itself, so what facilities we want to provide at stations, how you get to the stations themselves in terms of cycling, walking, connectivity with bus services and car parking, into the on-train experience, so what our fleet of trains will have to offer you as our future customers, who our colleagues are and at what point on your journey you interact with them, what you want that experience to be like, and then how we provide information to you at every stage along the journey. So we've asked some specific questions in this part of the consultation, and we're really keen to hear your feedback so that myself and my team can build in what your views are into how we develop and then design the railway from a customer perspective moving forward. Moving on to the infrastructure, as I mentioned previously, we've split this into 6 sections, and today we're covering sections E and F towards the east of the route there in the light blue box and the light green box. So we've had some key themes emerging, and myself and the team are going to take you through those various sections and answer some specific questions over the next 40 minutes or so. But I should say that we do have the Q&A function turned on this morning, and if we have time towards the end of the session, we may be able to answer some questions that are coming through today on this morning's session. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Paul to take you through a couple of specifics on section E and section F. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Maria. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Sparrow, Programme Manager for Connection Stage 3. I'll just take you through now a quick recap of what is involved with sections E and F on the route. So section E, we're looking at the part of the new railway from roughly the A603 road past Harlton and Haslingfield, past Hauxton, and then joining the existing Shepworth branch line, so the line from King's Cross into Cambridge. At the moment, we have an emerging preference for what we call a grade separated offline solution, and this is shown in the diagram. What this involves is us moving the existing Shepworth branch line to the southeast, so further away from Hauxton, and then putting in a grade separated junction for us to be able to join those tracks. The need for the grade separated junction has been driven entirely by operational requirements. So we've been performing assessments against the existing services, the Thameslink services that run on the King's Cross, from King's Cross into Cambridge, and how we can then join those existing services on the twin track railway without having a negative impact on those services, and still being able to fit in with also some spare time to allow for time delays that may occur as train services are operating. Another key point of this is it would involve the closure of the level crossing between Hauxton and Newton, and we'd be looking to put in a new road diversion to ensure that the connectivity between those two villages is maintained, as we understand how vital that connection is. So the next section then, section F, continues from where section E finishes. So from the overbridge of the M11, we'll be running on the existing railway from the M11 bridge all the way round to Shepworth Branch Junction, which is where the Shepworth branch joins the West Anglia main line running north-south into Cambridge. Running on that existing twin track railway means we don't need to widen this section. It means we don't need to impact the M11 bridge, and we don't need to impact the A1301 bridge either around Shelford. From that point, from Shepworth Junction, we will need to 4-track the railway into Cambridge. Before I go into a couple of details on that, I will mention that the level crossing between Hauxton and Little Shelford, or in Little Shelford, will need to be assessed in the next stage of design. We believe it's likely to need to be closed when the additional EWR services are added to that twin track railway. However, a further assessment is required to confirm whether that is necessary or not. From then Shepworth, the existing Shepworth Junction, we will be tracking up to the Addenbrooks Road, so the bridge that currently goes over the existing railway and has spare capacity for additional lines. At that point, we will be joining the 4-track railway, the Cambridge South project, a project being delivered by Network Rail, will be providing 4 tracks to that point, so we'll connect into those, and then we will continue the 4-tracking north of Cambridge South Station into Cambridge. It should be noted that we will be carrying out further assessments on Long Road Bridge to see whether or not we can fit the new tracks under the existing bridge, or whether a new bridge would be required. And north of Long Road Bridge, the railway from that point used to be a 4-track railway. It's currently a 3-track railway, and so we'll be expanding the railway back into 4 tracks, and it's likely that all of that will be able to be put in existing Network Rail land. Finally, we will need to add additional platforms at Cambridge Station, most likely to be on the east side, platforms 9 and 10, and that's to allow all services to be able to continue to be served at Cambridge Station, plus the EWR services, as we do know that Cambridge Station is constrained at present in terms of platform capacity. So that's a quick overview of sections E and F. What we'll be doing next then is going through some of your questions that have been asked in the previous sessions and giving you some answers. So I'll be handing back to Maria to take us through the first set of questions about freight.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. So one of the key themes that's been emerging is around what our plans are for freight on this railway, and it's something that we're really keen to talk to you more about and to give some more detail on where possible. So thanks, Caris. We've got a couple of key points to make. First of all, that in terms of creating benefits from freight, there are several areas that are accepted across both the industry and from an environmental perspective, that freight can be a quicker and sustainable way to move goods around the country. But I will start by saying that East West Rail is predominantly a passenger railway, and our scope is to provide the reliable services and incrementally increase the service. In our customer experience and operations section of the consultation document on page 34, you'll be able to see the train services that we plan to operate from a passenger perspective for each of the connection stages. But from a freight perspective, you'll be able to see on the slide in front of you that there are several benefits from freight, but for us it's about balancing the benefits that that modal shift creates with the needs and views of the local communities, which we're really keen to hear through the consultation. So we absolutely understand that there may be impacts if there is to be freight operated on this railway from a perspective of emissions and noise, and as part of the consultation process we want to understand how we can mitigate those potential impacts, be it through noise barriers or through the targets that government has set for both freight and passenger services from an emissions perspective. And Tristan from our environment team will talk you through a little bit more information on our approach to the environment. So thank you, Caris. Next slide, please. So we do have an objective set by government to support the existing freight services. So at the moment, on the parts of our route that exist today, so in the Oxford area, between Bletchley and into Bedford, and at the Cambridge end of the route, there is existing freight. and those freight services will continue to be accommodated as part of the future of our scheme. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is developing our freight strategy, and as part of that we're talking to freight operating companies to understand what the potential future demand could be for the route. And so as we progress to the statutory consultation part of our process, we'll be able to share much more detail and what our emerging views are. But we are building a railway that is freight capable. And the other thing that we have to take into account is the parts of the route at either end, so Oxford and Cambridge, and what impact there could be on existing infrastructure in order to operate freight on and off the East West Rail network, in terms of, again, the impacts of those from an environmental perspective and a potential need for upgrades. Thank you. So we've had some specific questions on freight, which I'm going to quickly talk through and give you some more detail on. So lots of questions from local communities around the hours of operation of freight and what the impact of noise could be. So from a noise perspective, I know that Tristan's going to cover that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. But from an hours of operation, in our customer experience and operations document on page 33, you'll see our proposed hours of operation dependent on the day of the week. And that is for both passenger and freight trains. So it is absolutely not our proposal to run freight trains through the night. And we understand, because we understand the impact that that can have on you, our residents and our future customers. So there is more detail on that in the document. But one of the things, in terms of the second question there, what will be the capacity of the line? We are carrying out an exercise at the moment, my team, on what our timetable will look like from the end-to-end Oxford to Cambridge perspective. And our initial proposals are for passenger services, and what we have to do is understand the paths that could be created between those passenger services for freight. So essentially, we'll continue to accommodate existing freight, but a freight path is a space in the timetable where freight could run without risking the reliability of the passenger services. So that capacity and those paths can be enhanced by providing additional sections of track, which are known as passing loops. And in the documentation, we've indicated where those passing loops could be provided. And what those do is make it possible for freight trains to be overtaken by passenger services or by slower passenger trains as well. So the number of freight paths that could be available, we hope to know that by the time of our statutory consultation. But the number of trains that would use our network is very much dependent on market forces and also on government policy. So we want to understand what the freight operating companies' future potential demand could be for our network. But certainly most modern freight services operate with clean and efficient locomotives, and there are legislative controls on emission levels. So we are designing the railway to include mitigation so that the impacts from all train services, including freight, are properly managed. So moving on to the third question. So what is the freight demand? So as I've said, we've been working with the freight operating companies and with Network Rail on their long-term forecasting to understand through engagement with the freight operating companies what their interest is in running freight services on our railway. And just finally, before I hand over, I want to make it clear that the 50 freight trains a day and 6 passenger trains a day is not what this railway is intending to deliver. It's 6 passenger trains per hour is what we are intending to operate from connection stage 3, and 50 freight trains a day is something that is a myth that we want to dispel, because the paths that we aim to provide, if we provide them for freight between the passenger services, is not yet known. So we understand that there's frustrations in the detail that we're able to provide, but it is still very much an emerging picture. And as we develop and mature our freight strategy and continue discussions with government and the freight operating companies, we will share that information with you at the statutory consultation stage. So thank you for your time. I'm going to hand back over to my colleague Tristan. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Hello, everybody. I'm Tristan Lincoln-Gordon. I'm an Environment and Sustainability Manager at East West Rail. I'm going to talk through a couple of key points that we want to get across from an environmental perspective, and then some of the questions that we have been asked. Could we go to the next slide, please? So first and foremost, it's worth saying that environment's a really important thing for us at East West Rail. It's really key and at the core of everything that we do and the decisions that we make. And we have a set of environmental principles which we're striving to deliver against. You can read about these on the website. There's 9 or so, and they cover some of the things I'm about to come on to. So things like carbon, biodiversity, etc. So for carbon, or from a carbon perspective, obviously carbon is very important. Climate change is something that's talked about a lot at the moment, and it's something that's very important to us at East West Rail. You'll be aware that the UK has a commitment to deliver net zero carbon, and they want to deliver this by 2050. So we're striving to deliver this railway in line with that government policy and the commitments that exist on things like diesel trains. So you'll be aware that the Department for Transport has an aspiration to remove diesel trains, passenger-only diesel trains from the network by 2040. So at the moment, what that means for us is we're developing our targets and we're developing our design with this very much in mind. So we're making sure we're designing the scheme in a way that will enable us to meet net zero carbon and doesn't impact the government's ability to meet its carbon reduction targets. You'll be able to read more about this in something called our environmental statement or our preliminary environmental information report, which I'll come on to in a little bit more detail later on. But within these documents, we'll report on our carbon footprint and what it means for the government's targets and our own targets that we've set ourselves. So moving on to biodiversity net gain, this also, like climate change and carbon, is something that's very, very important at the moment and very important to East West Rail. Hopefully you're aware that under the Network Rail delivered project on Connection Stage 1, this scheme committed to a 10% biodiversity net gain target. So in keeping with this and in keeping with current developing government policy, we're aiming to deliver a railway which delivers biodiversity net gain. And we haven't decided the exact target of that yet. That's something that we're still working through, but it's certainly our commitment to deliver a net gain of some sort. Again, we will report on this or give a little bit more detail as we move through the programme, and we have more information to share. From a sensitive approach to developing route alignments. So developing route alignments is probably the most important thing for us at the moment, and how we develop those. As the best opportunity for minimising the effect of the railway is to avoid direct impacts in the first place, we want to make sure that we get this phase of the project absolutely right. So we've done this by considering all aspects from an environmental impact at this stage of the design. So we think about noise, we think about heritage, from carbon to landscape. We've taken account of all of these as we developed. We've applied something called the mitigation hierarchy, and what this means at this stage of the project is that we primarily focus on trying to avoid impacts in the first place. So we try and avoid impacting or directly impacting environmental sites, which means we avoid creating direct impacts. We've implemented a decision and assessment process that seeks to design out environmental impact. You can read more about this. So what I'm referring to is our assessment factors. So we make sure that environment and all that range of different environmental topics are considered when we make these decisions. And you can see that within our technical reports. As a result, we've managed to develop a set of alignments that avoid direct impacts on the majority of the nationally important sites, such as SSIs, ancient woodlands, listed buildings. And as we move forward, we'll focus on continuing to reduce those direct impacts and also developing appropriate mitigation to minimise those impacts. And I suppose the next time you'll get to hear about this, or you'll see further information on it, is when we present something called our preliminary environmental information report, which is something that we'll publish alongside our statutory consultation in the coming year or so. This will be an assessment of the scheme as we see it at that point in time. It will present what we think the likely impacts are going to be, the information that we've collected from survey work and other things like that. And it will give you, the community and our stakeholders, an opportunity to properly understand what the likely impact of the scheme will be. Following that, we will submit something called an environmental statement, which again will be a very large and detailed document, which will be recording and representing the design that we're proposing to submit for development consent order and the associated environmental impact of that, and how we've gone about trying to mitigate that impact as far as we can. So moving on to flood. We appreciate where this railway is, and we appreciate that there are plenty of water bodies in the local area. So flood and the resilience to flooding is very, very important. We're working very closely, and we've established an ongoing and regular engagement with the Environment Agency to share information, share data, share access to flood models. And we're talking and having these discussions on the different issues around how we cross certain water bodies, how we maintain access, and what our construction methodology will look like. Ultimately, we'll need to develop and submit as part of the environmental statement something called a flood risk assessment. This will be a very detailed document looking or recording how we've gone about mitigating the impact on flood risk and made sure that we haven't made it worse. If we go on to the next slide, please. So using sustainable energy for our trains, the government has challenged the rail industry to produce a vision for the removal of diesel-only trains from the network by 2040, and we're very much aware of this, and we're also very much aware of our net zero carbon commitments and how we're going to get to achieving net zero carbon. So we're working very hard to explore the different options for a long-term fleet and how we can introduce new and emerging technologies to make sure we enable those to happen. From a protected species perspective, I hope there might be some landowners on the call who would have received access licenses and maybe even had some of our surveyors out on their land. We have been undertaking plenty of surveys over the past since May last year, and the reason that we do this is that we have to prepare this thing called the environmental statement, and to do that we have to have a really robust baseline of information. We have to collect that from existing sources, so maybe there might be local back groups, or there might be other experts that are aware of things that we're not aware of, and we also have to collect it through going out and undertaking surveys ourselves. So we've done a whole range of different surveys, and I know this point is about the Barbastels in particular, but we've done things like non-intrusive heritage surveys so far, and we've been mapping the different habitats that we know exist in the corridor, and we're doing things like water framework directive surveys to understand the quality of water courses. From a Barbastel perspective, we carried out a program of work last year, which was primarily focused on tracking Barbastels, so we can really understand where they are going, where they operate in the environment, and the flight paths that they take. I might talk a little bit about that later on with one of the questions. So impact on farms and land holdings. It's unavoidable that there will be an amount of loss or land that is lost to the railway, and that will have an impact on farms. But what we're really keen to do at this point is make sure that we try and minimise that as far as possible. So what we intend to do over the next few months is undertake a programme of farm business interviews, which are very catchy, but they are ensure a process of talking to farm managers and really understanding how they manage their farm, what they do on it, what fields are used for what, so we can build up a picture of how we can best mitigate the impact on those farms for our design. So if there are any farm managers on the call, it would be great when we do reach out to you for you to try and accommodate those calls, because it'd be very helpful to us, so we can gain a picture and we can feed that information into the design. Finally, from a community perspective, as I've kind of touched upon, the environmental statement and the EIA environmental impact assessment process requires us to consider a whole range of different environmental impacts. Much of those are focused on what that means for the community, so things like noise, air quality, potential vibration, traffic, impacts on public rights of way. I noticed that we had a question on that. These are all things that have to be considered through the environmental impact assessment process, and these are all things that we will have to work out how we think it's best to mitigate the impacts that we're having. So we'll work very closely with the design team as we move through the next sort of phase of the project to understand what those impacts are, to try and avoid those primarily, and if we can't avoid them, to try and mitigate them as best as we can. So we will consider, I know Maria talked a little bit about freight. We'll make sure that we fully understand what the implications are of the different trains that will be running on the railway, and we include that within our assessment so we can understand what level of mitigation that we might need from a noise barrier perspective, for example. If we go on to the next slide, please. I'll just grab a sip of water. So these are some of the questions that we've had from the community over the last, as a result of the events that we've had so far. So I'm just going to try and answer these to give a little bit more detail about what we're doing. So the first one's around how we can actually benefit, or how the line can actually benefit the environment. And as I've kind of said, caring for the environment is at the centre of everything that we try and do at East West Rail. At each stage of the design process and the way that we plan the railway, we're trying to make sure we consider environment at each of those stages and making sure our decision making and the assessment processes includes consideration of the environment. From a benefit perspective, we are targeting net zero carbon. We're also targeting a biodiversity net gain. So we're trying to make sure that the railway will have a net benefit at the end of this. More importantly, or not more importantly, but as importantly, we also have to consider things like cultural heritage and the landscape that the railway is going through. So we'll think really carefully about how we actually mitigate and potentially enhance the landscape as a result of the railway. And from a historic environment and cultural heritage perspective, we'll think about how we can make sure we create a legacy from the mitigation work, so the investigation work that we have to do prior to the railway coming through. That will help make sure that we leave a real benefit from a knowledge perspective from that cultural heritage angle. The next question, which I know we've been asked a lot of, is around why we're considering diesel and why we're not just going straight for electrification. And at this point, although no commitment has been made by the government to electrify the railway between Oxford and Cambridge, we need to make sure that the railway aligns with relevant policy and complies with relevant legislation and net zero carbon efforts. We're absolutely committed to running a sustainable railway in the long term with reduced emissions, including for carbon, nitrogen oxides and particulates. To that end, we're exploring how we can introduce new and emerging technologies in our long-term train fleet. And we'll be seeking input from bidders across the market to ensure they understand our environmental goals. As we move through this process and we get into our preliminary environmental information report, which we submitted with our statutory consultation, and our environmental statement, we'll report. We'll have to outline what our plans are, and we'll report on these and what the impacts of those will be.
And Tristan, can I just very quickly come in? Thank you. Just to elaborate slightly on the operation of the passenger services. So we are absolutely going to have an interim fleet of trains for our connection stage 1 to get our services up and running. What that allows us to do is to introduce the services sooner rather than later. But what the benefit of that is that we can, as Tristan said, explore new and emerging technologies. So it may be that we gain agreement on electrification, but it may also be that there's a hybrid approach here for battery electric trains, which could mitigate some impacts of overhead line and stanchions, which we know communities may find impair the environment visually for them. But it allows us to protect all of our options moving forward and enables us to make sure that our long-term fleet is not diesel, in line with the 2040 government challenge, as Tristan mentioned, and it protects our position to make sure that we've got the right fleet of trains operating on this railway for the long term. Thanks, Tristan. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. Thank you, Maria. So the next question is around when we're going to share environmental surveys and the data from environmental surveys. As I outlined earlier, or a couple of times, and it's a bit of a tongue twister, but our preliminary environmental information reports and our environmental statement will include all of the detail that we've based our assessment process and our decision making on. So that's all of the appendices full of survey information, the location where we found things, and what we found will be detailed. And they'll be provided so that we present complete transparency there. And then finally, around the Barbastell Back colony in the Wimpole Woods SAC, which I touched upon earlier. So we know that there are colonies around Cambridgeshire. We know that they are dotted around in different woodlands around the local environment, and we know that there is a special area of conservation which is designated for its population of barbastels. That location in particular is around 3 to 4 kilometres of the emerging route alignments between Bedford and Cambridge, and the potential alignments that we've identified don't directly impact the woodlands themselves, or at least where we know they are to roost. And as I kind of touched upon earlier, we've prioritised avoiding things like triple SIs, ancient woodlands, etc. So as a result, we don't anticipate that we would have a direct impact on any roosting colonies. We've also gone about trying to build a picture of where we think they are flying and where we think they are foraging through doing a load of survey work last year. We'll continue to do more survey work this year to continue to build up that picture, so we can properly understand where our line will interface with potentially foraging habitats or flight paths. And once we understand that, we can then hopefully start to implement different mitigation if it's required. So things like culverts, underpasses, green bridges that allow bats to pass safely from one side of the railway to another side. It's important to note that there is a strict and robust process for assessing the impact on a SAC and on a species such as barbastels, and we'll be following the habitats regulations process that's set out for us. We're working very closely with Natural England at the moment, talking about how best to survey, what the best approach for surveying is for these species, and making sure we build up a picture which will mean that we can ultimately mitigate any impacts that we think that we would have. And then finally, any mitigation that we do include within the scheme and the results of that assessment will be something that's very much binding within the obligations or the requirements of the development consent order. So it's something that we will have to stick to and we will have to comply with. And I think that's all the questions I've got.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Tristan. So we'll be moving on to next, looking at some of the questions that we've received about local benefits. So if we can go next slide, please. So the first question that we've received is, what will be the benefits of this rail line to the villages which experience severe detrimental impact? I think the first thing we want to say is we appreciate that this railway is going to be built on land and is going to have an impact on certain people and communities. It's something that is very high in our minds that we want to minimize as much as possible, but putting a new railway in is always going to have a level of impact. However, there will be some benefits to some of the villages around the place, and I think some of that will come from reduction of traffic loads, vehicle loads on roads in the area when the railway is up and running, and people can use the railway to get between places like Camborne and Cambridge South. And from an environment perspective, we haven't done any of the design yet on this, but we will be looking at environmental design, so placement of trees for visual and acoustic blocking, and these will naturally create some habitats as well. We'll put some thought into the attenuation tanks or the drainage ponds that we'll be putting in, and seeing how we can turn those from just being an engineering function to habitat creation and somewhere that people can visit and see how biodiversity can actually grow in areas like this. Because it should be noted that areas like the embankments and cutting slopes on railways tend to be areas that humans don't have access to, and so it allows biodiversity to thrive. Those are really the key points on that one, but we will be looking at, as well as active travel networks to see if we can increase the amount of walking routes and cycling routes that could make journeys between some of the villages a little bit shorter and a little bit healthier. I appreciate that this is relatively small stuff in comparison to this railway coming through, but these are things that we are thinking about to try and minimise that detrimental impact as much as we possibly can. And we have more design work to do on this, and this is part of the reason for this consultation, is to get your input. As as early as possible in the design process, so that we can do the right thing. The next question, why are we planning a 10-meter high embankment running past our village and many more, rather than considering a more sympathetic solution, such as a sunken line that will reduce noise pollution? A few points on this. Again, we appreciate that the railway is going to have an impact on some people and some communities. Our current design is being based on a reasonable worst case. What this means is that we haven't been overly optimistic about what we can achieve at an early stage when we don't have details, particularly in terms of geotechnics and topographic information, traffic surveys, that will allow us then to be able to perform some value management, which means improvements on the design that can help minimize some of these visual and noise impacts and footprint impacts on communities. At present, we do have high embankments in areas, but it should be noted that we've seen in the press that it's been claimed that we've got 7-kilometer long wall of embankment in the area. That is not true. We do have areas that are 10 meters high. The longest continuous section of around 10 meters is just over 1 kilometer long at the moment in this section, nowhere near the 7 kilometers that exists, or sorry, that has been claimed. And what we will be doing in the next design stage is looking to see whether or not we can lower the alignment. And the key constraints that we're looking at are things like waterways and floodplains, roads, and then the gradient of the railway itself, because we're not able to just be able to alter the height of the railway in a short distance. It does take a bit of time to be able to get it up and down and not create a roller coaster. One of the assumptions that we've used so far in the reasonable worst case design is that we would need to go over most of the roads. As per the policy of the Office of Rail and Road, we cannot put in new level crossings unless under exceptional circumstances. And so we do need to grade separate, i.e. put in different elevations, the road and the railway, which is not how railways had to be designed in the past. But we will be looking at the next stage to see whether there are better solutions where we could lower the railway and put roads over the top of the railway rather than the other way round. So at present, we do have some high embankments, but we will be looking to see how we can reduce that. I'd like to mention as well that we have to consider environmental conditions and particularly climate change. The recent landslip up in Scotland, where lives were lost, is an example of where existing railways are not designed for today's climate, and so this needs to be taken into account. And it's not just about today's climate, it's about the climate in 100 years as well. In terms of the sunken line solution, I mean, we've seen people posting about this. A couple of things on the sunken line is it's not an easy engineering solution. And in terms of achieving our carbon net zero, it would make that significantly harder, as the biggest contributor to carbon in the construction industry is concrete. Also, having a concrete or a sunken line wouldn't necessarily reduce noise pollution. We'd have to do some assessments on that, but when you're in an environment where the sound is actually captured rather than released, it can create an adverse effect to noise rather than a positive one. But modern rolling stock, particularly with continuously welded rail solutions, really is a lot quieter than the old clackety-clack railways that used to exist with the joints and the old rolling stock. Next question. I'm in my 70s and live in Hauxton, but have my doctor's surgery, pharmacy and local shops in Great Shelford. Will the level crossing at Little Shelford still exist, or will there be a bridge? If the crossing closes, it will cut me off from my local facilities, which I moved there here for. So on this one, I briefly mentioned it in the overview. We need to conduct further assessments of that level crossing to see whether or not it would need to be closed. What's key here is we as East West Rail do not set the thresholds and the rules about the closing of level crossings. Those are set by the Office of Rail and Road. And what we will be doing is conducting assessments of that level crossing with the increased East West Rail services on it, and to see whether or not it would then have to be closed based upon the threshold that exists within that assessment, that set of assessments. We still need to conduct that work, and once we have, we will then know whether or not that level crossing would need to close. We appreciate that closing level crossings can make life harder because it has the potential of making route distances to get to places a little bit longer. But as I say, the rules about the closing of level crossings are not within our bounds to go and change. And level crossings are some of the most dangerous elements of railways today. And so it's an important consideration, and it is a reason why the Office of Rail and Road have a policy to try and close as many level crossings as possible. At this particular site, if we were to need to close this crossing, we would be looking at alternatives. The first alternative would be to see whether or not we could put in a bridge or an underpass at the same location. If that is not possible due to proximity of houses, then we would look to see whether or not we could put a footbridge and a cycle bridge in the same location, and then put in a permanent road diversion to make sure that we don't sever those communities. The road diversion would almost certainly be a little bit longer, but we would, in terms of journey time, but we would look to minimize that as much as possible. And in case we do need to close this level crossing, I would welcome any views that people have in the area of what could be viable alternatives, considering the land take and journey times and what people need to do. I'm related to this. Elimination of any level crossings will certainly not make it easier to get around within the local area, which is what we have just been told is your aim. We totally understand this, and we appreciate that level crossings today do make it easy to be able to get across and between places directly. However, as I previously mentioned, the rules on level crossings do not sit with us. We have to do what has been set out by the Office of Rail and Road. So I appreciate it seems like that is contradictory information about closing level crossings and making it easier to get around, but where we do need to close level crossings, we will put alternative routes in, and we will make those as simple and easy as possible to make sure that journey times are not impacted as much as we possibly can. From this point, for the next question, I'll just hand over to Jorn, who will just take us through the compensation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So this question relates to compensation to homeowners in Hauxton and Harlton. Excuse me, I might have a little bit of background noise, but so firstly, our priority is to avoid our negative impact, and my colleagues have touched on the mitigation we'll be taking towards environmental and construction impacts, which factors into this. But on to support for landowners, at the moment we're consulting on the need to sell scheme, And this is for those going through hardship and who have a pressing need to sell but are unable to due to our proposals. We want to hear your views on this and whether you think it's the right support for those who are potentially affected, and if it isn't, what you would expect to see. Later down the project timeline, whether it's land adjacent to the scheme or land needed for the line of the railway, that there are statutory provisions available to landowners, and for land adjacent to the scheme, compensation may be available through what's called a Part 1 claim. And this is compensation claimed when a property is reduced in value by physical factors caused by the railway. We have a leaflet on that on our website which discusses it further. So please do take a look at that and attend one of our live chat events if you've got any questions on it. And then lastly, for land which may be needed by our proposals, landowners would receive the market value, ignoring the effect of the scheme. There's another land and property slide within this webinar, and I'll discuss some of these elements further at that point. So in the meantime, I think I'll hand back to Paul.
Yes, thanks, Jorn. And just before we move on to the next section, we did receive a quick question that was asked about two specific roads, so the Harlton to Haslingfield Road and Washpit Lane. And I just thought I'd mention and answer the question on that as to what would happen. The current design for those roads is that they would remain open in their current location. The railway currently would go over the top of those roads based on the reasonable worst case design that we have today. And so there would be what we term as an underbridge that would allow the road to remain open in that location. As I say, we will be looking at whether or not we can lower the railway. If we do lower the railway in this location, then we would certainly be looking at putting the road then over the railway to keep it open, again in a similar location. So moving on then, be looking a bit at questions asked about the northern route into Cambridge. So the first thing really to highlight is that back in the consultation in early 2019, we did consult on 5 route options, and all of those approached Cambridge from the south. And this was based on operational, engineering, economic and environmental reasons. So an assessment had already been done at that point as to what the best way was to enter into Cambridge, and several options were looked at that time. But entering from the south was deemed to be the best route. In that consultation, we did ask whether people felt that it would be right to prioritise that route, and we did receive a number of responses back stating that there was still a preference from those people about approaching Cambridge from the north. However, the overall conclusion was still that approaching Cambridge from the south was preferable, and this was included in the route option selection report in January 2020. And feedback from the communities and stakeholders during that consultation was one of the key components of that decision that was made to select route option E. So moving on. So how do the north and south routes compare? Well, we were conscious that when we started looking at a Camborne North Station location, that the distance between Camborne North and Cambridge Station when approaching from the north or the south was roughly the same, although the south is still slightly shorter by about 1 kilometre. And so looking at this new Camborne North Station location, we thought it appropriate to take a look again at whether or not approaching Cambridge from the north was the right thing to do. And included in this option was looking at a proposal of a Northstowe station, which would actually be located just south of Oakington, so the southern end of Northstowe. But the key points really in doing this comparison are that it is a slightly shorter distance, and the journey times are a little bit better from the south, but predominantly because of the new station proposed at Northstowe. The existing lines are running slightly faster to the south on the WAML, West Anglia Main Line, south of Cambridge rather than to the north. But actually, the key journey time differentiator is really with the additional station stop. The southern approach has significantly less infrastructure on floodplain. We would avoid putting the railway on floodplain as much as we possibly can. There are areas where we simply can't avoid it. However, there is a significant difference between the flood zone areas to the north in comparison to the south. And our current thinking and planning is that we would need a form of viaduct to go over those flood zones so as to not impact on the flood area that exists today. But we are conducting further work with the Environment Agency to see whether or not that is still the correct course. But it would mean that with those additional flood zones, there would be additional structures, and where we would be on embankment, and in that area it would all be raised due to the flat nature to the north, so you wouldn't have a cut-fill balance. We would need to import material, and we would need to think about stabilization of those formations where they are in difficult terrain, which would increase cost and also have a resilience issue and a maintenance issue on the railway going forward. But one of the key points is that there would be fewer property acquisitions and demolitions on the southern approach in comparison to the north. And this is because operational modelling has demonstrated that we would need to four-track the West Anglia Main Line from the point at which we join it when approaching from the north around the Milton area between Milton and Waterbeach, all the way into Cambridge Station. And that previously hasn't been a four-track railway. Now, whilst we would still need to four-track the WAML, the West Anglia Main Line on the southern approach as well. So shorter distance, it's a much clearer route. It wouldn't require property acquisition there. And a section of it was four-track railway in the past. And so we have a comparison of about 5 individual properties at 2 farm locations on the southern route versus 39 to 84, depending on which route option for the north. So there is a substantial difference there. And it's still being demonstrated that there are additional benefits associated with a new station at Cambridge South, and joining there with the expansion of the biomedical campus as a world-leading biomedical campus and well-recognised campus, and being able to connect Camborne and the housing to Camborne to the jobs at the biomedical campus is significant. So moving on to the next slide, please. So these are just a few numbers. They're in the document, the Appendix F to the technical document, just showing some of the stuff I've talked about. So you can see the southern route, as I say, is about 1 kilometre shorter, nothing significant there. But the flood zone length is significantly different, and the number of properties directly impacted, i.e. demolition and acquisition, is significantly different. So if we can move on to the next one, please. So a few questions that we've received then on the northern approach. Do you think you have done enough research on the southern approach to arrive at your decision? If yes, do you not think the alternative approaches, specifically the northern approach, should be afforded the same research so it can be considered in parity? We are continuing to do our work on both the southern and the northern approaches, but the information and the assessments that we have conducted so far have already shown, as you can see from the previous table, that the southern approach is still the preferred option versus the northern approach. I think a key point here is that whilst we understand that villages are impacted with the railway line coming to the south, there are built up areas and villages to the north that are also impacted. And so a northern approach doesn't remove that impact. And then it has additional impact as we go into Cambridge on the existing network with the new 4 tracking. So the southern and the northern approaches have been compared to the same level of detail for sections of them, and then we are still updating the information for particularly the offline sections, so the greenfield sections, and all of that information will be then available at a later date. However, it must be highlighted that the level of assessment that we have conducted so far is still telling us that the southern approach is preferential to the northern approach. How many northern options were proposed? The route presented appears unnecessarily long. Well, for this, what we have done with all of the designs of the railway, including the northern approach, is looked at a route that does not go through built up areas and misses key environmental assets, so avoids them. The northern option does exactly that. But it also needs to look at the possibility of putting a station in at Northstowe, and so that drives it to pushing it just south of Oakington and then across to the West Anglian Main Line. If you look at the map, and the mapping is available on our website with the environmental constraints on it, you'll quickly see that actually the alignment that has been proposed is the quickest route whilst avoiding the built up areas and the environmental assets and being able to call it Northstowe. Surely the train should go via the new town of Northstowe. This is where the population is growing significantly and ought to have good transport links. A guided busway is not enough. We understand that Northstowe is a significant development and one of the largest in the areas. However, the planning application that is being given for the Northstowe developments does not require a railway to go there, and the existing public transport systems and upgrades to existing public transport systems would be provided and would be sufficient to be able to make sure that Northstowe has the connectivity that it needs. I understand that the busway does have some constraints at the moment and is at capacity. However, we're not aware that a railway service is actually required to that location at this point in time. It should also be noted that where the potential railway station could go on a northern approach for Northstowe is significantly far, to the south of the main development area. So whilst we can see that phase 3 of Northstowe does come to the northern edge of Oakington village, the actual town centre of Northstowe, even in its final state, is some 3 kilometres north of that. And so you would need sufficient additional public infrastructure to be able, public transport infrastructure to be able to get you to the station. So that's the situation with that at the present. And then finally, wouldn't a 10-metre high embankment being built on the southern route address the floodplain issue in the northern route? Well, a viaduct at 10 metres high would, yes. And looking at the design so far, that's exactly what we would have. So there's a parity there right now, given the design requirements we're operating to, that the northern approach would have some areas which are 10 metres high, similarly to the southern approach. So absolutely. And I think that's it then for section F at this point in time, and I'll hand over to you on to get you a bit more information for landowners.
Yeah, Thanks again, Paul. Conscious we're running over slightly here, so I'll just kind of focus on a few key points, particularly on the need to sell scheme, and thank you for those who have provided feedback on that to date. Some of the questions we've been receiving on that are to answer some of these. There's been some around the purchase price, and that would be at the unaffected market value of the property. There isn't a set distance in which the scheme applies, and if introduced, it would be at the point of the preferred route alignment announcement point, which is expected to be later this year. So just emphasise the point that we would really value your feedback, so please do get in touch and let us know if you think it's the right mitigation. There's further information on our website, and if you've got any questions, please get in touch through our contact channels or attend one of our live chat events where you can talk to one of our experts. I'll now pass back to Claire, who will discuss the consultation process further.
Thanks very much, Jon. So again, I'm very conscious of time, so I want to let you know there are lots of different ways you can get involved in this consultation, and we really want to hear from you. Thank you for attending today. You will know that we've got virtual consultation rooms on our website. We have live chat events, and go onto our website and it will list out when they are going to be. And basically, this is your opportunity to speak to one of our experts and have a two-way conversation. It'll be through the computer. And again, our preferred way of speaking with you would be face-to-face, but due to the current pandemic, we're not able to do that at present. But please do come along to a live chat event, and you'll be able to put your question to one of our experts, and you'll be able to have a conversation. We also have a dedicated phone line because we are aware that not everybody is online and not everybody is comfortable in a digital space. So if you have a neighbour who wants to take part and isn't online, please share the telephone number with them, so that we'd like to hear back from as many people as possible. Please look on the website for our feedback form. You can get hard copies of all the information as well, and we encourage you to get back to us as soon as possible. The closing date is the 9th of June. Next slide, please. So really, there are lots of different ways you can actually respond to the consultation. So you can submit your feedback form online or by emailing it to us at consultation@eastwestrail.co.uk, or you can send it to us at our free post address. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want paper copies of the form or of any of the information, you can phone us at contact@eastwestrail.co.uk or call us on the number there. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what's next? Please stay in touch. Any questions you feel we haven't answered, please come along to our live chat events and put the questions to our experts, who will be very pleased to help you. We have had many responses so far to the consultation, which is excellent, and we're looking forward to receiving many more. And again, thank you very much for spending this time with us today, and we hope you'll come to further webinars, and we hope to see you at live chat events as well. And I'd say I wish you all a very good day, and thank you very much for being with us today, and goodbye from us.